when you're doing the initial assessment, this is generally going to be happening in the first couple of days. First couple of days of the spill, money's not an option. It's not an issue. People are going to be spending money like crazy. They want to get this thing figured out. They want to stabilize it. And that usually means you've got helicopters flying around like crazy. Commandeer one of those things and have a look from the sky at what your spill looks like. Because what you're going to see from a bird's eye view is going to be a lot different than what you see on the ground. So this is what you're going to see on the ground. So get up in the air, have a look at it, and it's going to allow you to at least figure out which direction you need to be working in. Electromagnetic surveys. We're not necessarily using these anymore to kind of be an initial assessment. We're using it as a confirmation of our initial assessment. EM surveys come out and it basically reads conductivity in the soil, in the water, and it gives you a very good visual indicator of where your spill originated and where it traveled to. One of the good things about EMs is it also picks up impacts at depth. Using an EM31, you can figure out if you do have deep impacts or if your spill just remained in the surface. Another good thing too is it'll actually allow you to pick up slugs or parts of your spill path that may have separated from the primary spill path that you may have missed during delineation efforts. Because typically once you get past your leading edge, you think you're good, but you might be 5 meters away from the slug that's actually separated because you've started containment and recovery. Drone surveys. Once again, technological advances in drones is unbelievable. This is a picture of one of our spill sites here. Using a drone, we were able to take roughly 210 aerial photographs, stitch them together, georeference those photos, and then use that georeference photo to overlay EMs, sample locations. This is important because a lot of the aerial photographs or satellite imageries that you're going to get are going to be outdated by 2 years. So a lot can change in 2 years, especially in Alberta, right? So the more recent you can have for aerial photos, the better your imagery is going to be, the better your product at the end of your job is going to be. Also with drones, they have the ability to attach different types of lenses. Infrared, picking up heat traces. A lot of the pipelines in northern Alberta run at around 70 degrees. So initially you'll pick up steam coming off the ground, but then you'll lose it. One of these drones with an infrared camera is actually able to pick up heat traces underneath snow, stuff that you might not be able to catch. Also vegetation health, we were talking about it here at the table. They are actually able to attach a lens that will pick up differences in the health of vegetation. So the advances are basically endless. Involve yourself with a drone company if you're going to be doing spills because they will be able to help you. And then software programs. This is Surfer, basically. What we do at the beginning of initial response is that we will submit chloride concentrations based off field screening information to our drafter, and she'll apply this to Surfer to create a chloride contour map. This is very important, especially at the beginning, because everybody's running around crazy. Nobody wants to look at tables. It's too much data to piece through and everything else. Visual indication of what's going on your site is going to mean the world to the regulator, going to mean the world to the client. So if you can plot it into a software program and give them a visual representation of what's going on that site, it's going to go a long ways. Another good use for this is that it can actually show you data gaps. Where have you missed potentially impacted concentrations? If you look at the southern part of that diagram, we actually haven't collected enough samples. We haven't closed the site off. So add another 2 sample points and then we have the full delineation. And then also, depending on where you're going to be working, Aboriginal traditional knowledge, otherwise known as traditional ecological knowledge, ATK. This is becoming more of an important aspect of spill response, especially in situations where you're dealing with Aboriginal communities. To work hand in hand with these people, they have such a unique perspective and a knowledge of the ecosystems that you're dealing with that is totally outside of Western science. They understand how it functions, the relationships that are involved at these sites. It doesn't necessarily give you a guideline or anything like that. It just gives you a broader perspective on what you should be looking for once you arrive on these sites. To date, there's not really a set standard on completing an ATK, so you need to be able to communicate with the community, involve them, and the stuff that you'll be provided with at the end of these projects is actually pretty interesting. Now that we've got our area affected, it's huge. You've got 100,000 square meters of affected area. It's overwhelming. You just want to pack up and go home. looking at these big spills as an overall affected area, it's daunting, it's stressful, and it's overwhelming. So what we've started doing, and I imagine everybody else is really doing it too, is just establish smaller spills within the large picture. Break your site up into divisions. So these divisions can be created based off of impact concentrations, topography or landscape features, access points like right-of-ways or cut lines. Essentially anything that's going to make this spill easier for you to organize within your mind, organize to your client so that everybody can understand it easier. So in this situation, the picture's not that easy to see. We had a spill that's 2 kilometers, basically from start to finish. What we discovered was there was basically road crossings all throughout the spill path. Usually involved with the road is going to be culverts. Water loves to go through culverts, so does spill fluids. So we utilize the culverts as containment and recovery points, but we also utilize them as division start and end points. That way we were able to break this 2 kilometer long spill into 6 divisions based off of landscape features. For this site, this spill is about 90,000 square meters. All of it is fen, so terrible access, willows roughly 2 meters tall, so poor visibility. It's very easy to get lost out there. Once we established our walkway pathways and everything else, we actually had to build signs so that people could figure out which division and where they were going, right? So what we did here was we basically created divisions based off of impact concentrations or impact types. The area in purple was hydrocarbon impacts, needed to be completely isolated from the rest of the system, full containment. Area in yellow was extremely high concentrations of sodium chloride that would have affected wildlife. So we used Division 2 to establish a wildlife and amphibian fence to mitigate the potential for harm to the wildlife in the system. And then the areas in pink and the areas in white were lower concentrations of sodium chloride that we figured were manageable and could be left in place without too much remediation effort other than some recovery. And then the area that's in turquoise there was an area that never really made sense to us based off of the initial assessment. Further detailed assessment down the road actually indicated it was a historical spill. So each of these divisions, now that you've got it organized, you can actually apply containment strategies, assessment methods, different remediation endpoints, and reclamation and restoration practices. You can basically make 6 different spills within one spill and treat it as its own. Makes it easier for everybody. So now you're getting into a detailed assessment. This is going to include vertical profiles. Now we're starting to worry about where did it go downwards. This is going to be both in soil and in water. Conceptual site models, a visual depiction of what happened on the site, data trending, and confirmatory analysis. And then we're going to use this to direct the remainder of our remediation efforts. The detailed assessment, we need this in order to establish what is being affected fully by this release. Those are going to be your pathways or receptors. But at the same time, you're also going to use that to start excluding some of those pathways. What's not being affected? What can I apply to this site in order to benefit the ecosystem and also benefit the client? Site-specific characteristics, more in-depth background sampling, and now you can start adjusting your parameters of concern. Nickel shows up in your initial assessment, but then further backgrounds and everything else shows that nickel is naturally occurring on the location. Let's remove that from a parameter of concern. Why are we chasing it? It's going to give you a 3D representation of what the release has done to this site, and it's going to initiate all aspects of a remediation action plan. So for a vertical profile assessment, you need to verify the plume, the impact plume. You get a phone call. They reported 5 cubes of oil emulsion spilled onto an upland forested area, small area, completely contained. You arrive on site and yeah, it looks like 5 cubes on the ground. 25 square meters been affected. Let's scrape her up, get it in a truck, and let's get out of there, right? In this instance, what you see on the right-hand side, we started doing the pipeline exposure, find the break point, and then EC started getting higher and higher the deeper we went. What's going on here? Shut down digging, bring in a drill rig. We actually discovered that the spill fluids, instead of coming to the surface, went straight down 25 meters into a groundwater aquifer. So sometimes when you arrive on site, if it looks small, you might only be seeing the tip of the iceberg. You got to understand that spill fluids want to take the path of least resistance. So if you've got sand seams, gravel seams, fractured clays, any of this stuff is going to affect where that spill fluid wants to go. In the instance of this one, we had a heavy clay overburden that was frozen at the time, and the pipeline had actually been installed on top of a sand seam. Didn't want to go up, we wanted to go down. So doing your vertical profile assessment, characterize the lithology of the site, find those seams, and then that way you can track down your spill fluids a lot easier. So for the vertical profile assessment, like I was saying, exclude your potential pathways, DUAs, even eco-soil contact, irrigation, livestock watering. If you can confirm where the impacts are at depth, you can apply that to a lot of the different pathways that are given to us in the guidelines in Alberta. One of the other things I wanted to touch base on, though, is a vertical profile assessment doesn't necessarily mean a phase 2. Typically, the consultant's best friend is a hand auger. Arriving onto a wetland bog site, your vertical profile assessment is essentially figuring out how thick the organic layer is. Characterizing, I've got 3 meters of organic material overlying a heavy clay substrate. You found your confining layer. Wetlands are characterized by poor drainage, poor drain systems that hold water. So you know that confining layer is there somewhere, identify it, so that you can basically apply that to how you're going to assess the site. You're hand augering through organic material, throw that soil on the ground. You don't want to touch it. Basically what you want to do, find your confining layer, grab a sample of that mineral soil and confirm that it hasn't been affected by the release. Chlorides haven't impacted that, clays or whatever, and then pull the hand auger out and backfill it with a screened pour water monitoring well. Same stuff that you use for groundwater wells. We call them dry points. I think everybody calls them dry points. And depending on the depth of those organics, you're going to want to have screened intervals throughout the organics. If you've got 3 meters of peat, you need to have a screen showing what the produced water spill has done to the top part of the peat and also to the bottom. Specific gravity of produced water spills into a bog, not necessarily that much greater than the water that you're going to find there naturally, but chlorides typically want to dive if they're given the opportunity to dive. So look at the bottom of your system on top of that confining layer to make sure that you've covered the entire profile. Identifying these deeper impacts is also going to change how your containment and recovery strategies are being completed. Typically at this time, you've got vac trucks or trash pumps pulling water from the surface. Now all of a sudden you've identified that you've got impacts traveling on top of a confining layer at 3 meters. You need to start getting bell holes in place down to 3 meters so that you can pull the plume or the volume of that mass out of that system so that it doesn't get away from you. Conceptual site models. Once again, it's basically just a visual depiction of how your spill occurred. What happened? Where did it go? How did it get there and what is it affecting? Data trending, long-term monitoring. Once again, these wetland spills, you're going to be sampling every single point that you apply to that site every single day for weeks for laboratory submission. Until the regulator tells you, okay, you've got enough data, we trust you, you can scale back and you can do daily field screening. Thank you. And then all this information needs to be plotted. And you're going to use this to basically determine the success of your remediation. You can show that on day 1 you had 8,000 parts chloride, and then after 3 months of recovery and flushing, all of a sudden my chlorides are around 400. Shows the success, it's visual, everybody loves visuals, so use it, it works very well. Essentially the ultimate goal for the detailed assessment is to implement the right remediation strategy. You want to do what is best for the site. So to get into remediation, I'll touch base a little bit on mineral sites, and I'll also touch base on the wetland soil, similar to what I've already been doing. Just keep in mind, the remediation starts the minute you show up on site and you start pulling source fluid off the ground. That is remediation. You're starting to clean up the site within the first hour of the project. So whether it's surface water or if you're scraping up slurry or soil off the ground, your remediation has already started. That being said though, day 1 to the last day, that remediation strategy is never going to stay the same. You have to be adaptive. You have to be able to think on your feet in order to change that strategy to suit what's best for the stakeholders and what's best for the site. One of the best things to start doing is establish remediation endpoints. Engage your stakeholders. Who's involved with this project? So what's going to be best? How are we going to get to the best possible endpoint for this project based on what everybody wants? But then on top of that, identify what's best for the site as well. Because ecosystem functionality is one of the most important parts, especially with wetland sites, because these sites aren't easily restored. You can't put these back to the past end land point readily and available. So you need to ask yourself, what has been released into this site, and can my site actually heal itself with just a little bit of outside help, as opposed to doing a ton of disturbance? Another thing that's great to do is set up short-term and long-term guidelines. These are typically going to be assigned to chlorides, because those are going to be the impacts that are going to be there for the longest term. What we've normally done in the past is we've assigned a threshold of around 1,000 parts chloride, milligrams per liter. And this is typically assigned based off of livestock watering, which is also applied to wildlife watering. What are wildlife going to be out there drinking? And what they've found is that actually 1,000 parts chloride is actually desirable by a lot of these species. So to leave that in place, even though it's well above the guidelines set aside in the surface water quality guidelines, it's actually acceptable to leave it in place for a short term as long as you're monitoring. That being said, now your long term is typically going to be applied to freshwater aquatic life, and the current guideline for that is about 120, and it's based off of exposure, toxicity testing, all that stuff that I'm not a genius on, believe me. So, but we have applied it to our sites, basically every single site that we've had produced water into wetlands. Site-specific guidelines. There's 4 different types of methods that can be used in order to assign these guidelines. Natural backgrounds, once again, find your background concentrations. Recalculation procedure shown here is based on receptors. And water effect ratio, that's your toxicity standard, or the substance toxicity versus the standard water toxicity that's already in that system. And then the resident species procedure, which is the one that typically gets used the most, at least in our experience, is the resident species procedure, which just looks at the site locally using the water effect ratio and the recalculation procedure put together. So your short-term and your long-term guidelines are basically going to be dependent, like we said, on your toxicity studies. Whoever is completing those for you, the receptors that are going to be involved, but also the timeline that you've been assigned by a client. A lot of these sites go for years. We're not necessarily talking about cleanup and site closure within months. We're talking a long period of time. Is your client willing to accept that? Take that into account. And also the stability of the site. If your site is next to a fish-bearing stream and your containment is shaky at best, your long-term and short-term guidelines are going to be affected by that. So you've got to take that into account, is how stable is your site. Some of the other considerations, pathway exclusions, subsoil salinity tool. If you guys can ever find the unicorn site that you can apply subsoil salinity to, it's a great tool. Also remote forested guidelines. If it fits the parameters for it, apply it. Now, I know there's a couple guys here from Secure, so I don't want to say dig and dump is evil. Actually, no. Dig and dump has an amazing place in the role of remediation. It's absolutely acceptable. In the picture you see below, everything to the north, east, south, and west of that picture is houses. So to leave impacts in place on that site would have been a logistical nightmare for the client. I don't want to deal with it. I don't have the time. Let's dig it, throw it in a landfill. So here's another example, basically utilizing pathway exclusion. For a hydrocarbon release, we responded to on agricultural land. We completed the source removal, basically to expose the pipeline, figure out how the release happened, and start doing a detailed assessment on the site. During the pipeline exposure, we started realizing that there was impacts in higher concentrations than we were expecting. So we shut down the excavation, brought in a drill rig, and we did a phase 2. Assessment indicated about 35,000 cubes or 34,000 cubes of impacted material with about 16,000 cubes of overburden above it. But we also identified that there was a high probability for pathway exclusions for the site. So we were able to exclude the DOA. Low conductivity in the groundwater aquifer, plus we also had a confined layer greater than 5 meters. We were able to protect groundwater for aquatic life because there was no FALs within the allotted distances. Exclusion for soil, eco-soil contact. We had already dug out the pipeline. Let's dig it out to 3 meters. Why not? Livestock and irrigation. We're already in there. Let's take it down to 4 meters. Exclude both those pathways. At the end of the project, we ended up treating 5,000 cubes of hydrocarbon impacted soil And then we had landfill 350 tons. So sorry secured, but worked out good for the client. Wetland remediation. Oil emulsion release is typically going to happen in the middle of a fen, middle of a bog, and you're going to have to do source removal and landfilling on those hydrocarbon impacted soils that also have extremely high concentrations of sodium chloride right around the breakpoint. There's typically no way around digging and dumping that portion of your spill. However, the remainder of the release is typically only affected by sodium chloride that's being held up in solution in your surface water. So isolate your source, contain it. It's the middle of July, there's no way you're going to get out there with equipment properly, so just leave it in place, it's not going anywhere. Confirm it through data collection, but there's no point in throwing rig mats on the ground and getting yellow iron out there to make a gigantic mess. Leave it in place till wintertime. That's the best time to do the remediation. Surface water remediation, therefore, is going to be a series of isolation and passive containment methods, recovering fluid from the system. Keep in mind, while you're recovering fluid out of organic material and drying that material out, you're actually encouraging the sodium chlorides to come out of solution, which may potentially allow it to impact the organics or to dive deep and impact your confining layer. So what you need to do is keep it in saturation. This is done through flushing techniques. When I say flushing, and I only say this because I know everybody in here doesn't do spill response or doesn't do this type of work, but also operations are typically the people that are going to be involved in this. And I have seen an operator standing in the middle of a fen with a fire hose just throwing water on the ground. Basically all that encourages is fresh water being pushed into a recovery point. So now you've basically taken clean water, put it in a recovery hole, threw it in a truck, and then downholed it somewhere or hauled it off to New Alta. Encourage natural saturation similar to rainfall using sprinkler systems or perforated hoses. This allows at least the top half meter of organics to remain in saturation. It doesn't encourage erosion or surface runoff. It keeps the site saturated, keeps your impacts in solution. For people that forest or anything like that, they also know if you dry out an organic system, you'll actually kill it off. And then the next year when you arrive, your spill site actually looks 3 times worse because you've pulled the water from the surrounding area into your spill area and dried the whole system out. So keep it in the saturation. Like I said before, surface flushing basically only saturates the top half meter. What North Shore has started working on is what we call the dissolved phase contaminant recovery system, or DPCRS. This is essentially injection stakes that are screened at intervals so that you can apply these to your site, injecting them into the organics at whatever depths you feel needs saturation, and then with pressure pumps injecting fluid into the system. This also allows you to direct spill fluids through the organics into recovery points as you move the injection stakes throughout the spill path. So here's a picture of it. Essentially, it's just a steel pole with perforation at the bottom of it, and we put a pressure gauge on it because you don't want to apply too much pressure. Too much pressure creates conduits throughout the organics, and then you're not helping anything. So keep it under low pressure, push it through the system, and it improves your recovery and the cleanup of your site. So now you've been doing all this, how do you determine the success of your remediation? It's basically just through detailed assessment. You've continued confirmatory analysis. It never ends. You've got to do it basically until the end of the project. So data trending, collection. You're still collecting samples. Hopefully at this point you're only collecting them twice a year. You're not collecting them every day. Depends on how bad the site is and how well you've worked with the regulators. Utilizing EM scans again. It's a great visual to show the effects of your remediation and how you've reduced the source plume involved with your spill site. And also using your surfer program, software programs. It's going to show how your plume has been reduced through contaminant recovery. And then this site here is essentially that's all we've done is we've just pulled fluid out of the ground, and those are actual laboratory reported results showing the contaminant plume being reduced. So basically you got to ask yourself at the end of the job, have you met your endpoints? Are your stakeholders satisfied? Not just your client. Are the Aboriginal communities, are the residential communities, are the regulators? Is everybody satisfied with what you've done there? And is the ecosystem still functioning? Have you allowed that site to be what it was meant to be, or have you completely disturbed it and changed it so that it'll potentially never be a wetland again? Something that you need to ask yourself. So now that your remediation for that year is done, what's your next step? You need to establish, do you need a long-term monitoring plan? Because you're still going to have impacts left in place. You're going to be within your short-term guideline, but now you need to continue monitoring that site in order to meet your long-term remediation endpoints. Reclamation and restoration. A lot of times you'll talk to spill guys, and spill guys don't talk to rec guys, and the rec guys have a wealth of knowledge that you could be using in order to reclaim these sites so that you have faster restoration, better growth, and it puts your site back to where you need it to be. And then essentially the goal is closure, site closure. You don't get a big certificate or anything else at the end of these jobs. You get an email from Alberta Environment saying, good job, site's closed. So just keep that in mind too. There's no party at the end of these jobs. So
no jumbo check.
No jumbo check. I don't get anything. Yeah, just a pat on the back and sent out again. So I'd like to thank Court Sando from Chemistry Matters. He helped me out a lot with the biological or biogenic toluene analysis, and as well as Exova. So yeah, thank you guys.